Stepping up peace efforts in Yemen, the UN's attempts to revive talks to end the three-year civil war find support from key players. But what will it take to stop the vicious cycle of violence, death, disease and hunger in one of the world's poorest countries? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The UN's last attempt a few weeks ago to bring the warring sides in Yemen to the table failed. The Houthis didn't make it to Geneva, blaming travel problems. But the UN Special Envoy, Martin Griffiths, refuses to give up, and he's hopeful that new talks can now take place. Al Jazeera's Bernard Smith reports.
So Yemen's Foreign Minister Khalid al-Yemeni says his government is prepared to recognise the Houthis as a political movement through a democratic process, he says. But what his government is not prepared to accept is the Houthis becoming the Yemeni equivalent of the Lebanese group Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a heavily armed Iranian-backed group in Lebanon, and it holds considerable influence over political life in Lebanon.
The
Yemeni government made many concessions during the consultations in Kuwait, but there are red lines that cannot be crossed, like not allowing in Yemen what is happening in Lebanon, where a party like Hezbollah creates hurdles in the political process. The government could accept the Houthis as a political movement within the political community in the country through a democratic process that reflects their true size.
And the UAE's foreign minister, Anwar Gargash has tweeted that he fully supports UN proposals for new talks soon. The UAE's troops are fighting alongside Yemeni government forces. And the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, he says that he's convinced the Houthis are also prepared to talk. So the priority now for Martin Griffiths is to get all sides around the table as soon as possible.
It's got to be within weeks. I don't think we can allow it to be delayed until kind of over the horizon, because the problem with that is, and I've been reassured this week meeting people here in New York, that people lose the narrative of peace. And once you lose the opportunity to talk about a settlement, the narrative of war becomes dominant, and that's what we must try to get away from.
For now, though, the fighting and the airstrikes continue. Since June, much of those airstrikes have been centred around the strategically important port of Hodeida. Yemen remains blockaded at sea and by air. The UN is warning that the country is on the verge of famine, and already there are reports of children dying from malnutrition. And this is a conflict where at least 20,000 people have been killed since fighting began.
Well, let's remind you of previous UN attempts to get the warring parties in Yemen together. The first round of talks was held in Geneva in June 2015, 3 months after the Saudi-led coalition entered the conflict. But that meeting collapsed after Yemen's government in exile accused Houthi representatives of refusing to meet them. Later that same year, the UN managed to organise negotiations that lasted for 6 days. They agreed a mass prisoner swap, but nothing else of significance. Fast forward to Kuwait in April 2016. That's the last time the sides actually met. But after 108 days, the talks ended with no agreement. Right, let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From London, we're joined by Andreas Krieg, an assistant professor at the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. From Sanaa is Hussain al Bukhaiti, a Yemen affairs analyst and journalist. And from Bristol, Sabah al-Kozai, a political commentator and lecturer at the City of Bristol College. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Andreas, let's start with you. As we heard Bernard Smith saying there, Yemen's foreign minister has said that his government could accept the Houthis as a political movement through a democratic process that highlights their true size, but that the Houthis wouldn't be allowed to become like Lebanon's Hezbollah. There are red lines that cannot be crossed, he said. Does that get us anywhere if and when the peace talks resume?
Right. I mean, for the time being, I think these are not peace talks per se. I think the first talks will be about a ceasefire because the war is still ongoing. I think peace talks will come after there is an established ceasefire and some sort of agreement of where this peace talks could actually lead the various parties. The issue generally is with the Yemeni foreign minister or the Yemeni government, the officially recognized government, is that it doesn't have that much leverage, and it's actually not one of the most important players in Yemen. In many ways, it's a puppet or a surrogate of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, so they don't really make decisions on their own. It is a good sign that they show at least a willingness to accept the Houthis or Ansar Allah as a political movement and political party that is part of the process, because that was one of the things, one of the contentious issues that for a very long time the Emiratis and the Saudis have rejected, to accept that actually the Houthis are part of Yemen and they should be part of any political process that comes after the war. The issue, however, is, and that will be long-term, for the peace process will be to determine what is actually the actual weight of the Houthis in Yemen and what is the kind of size that is proportionate to the kind of political and also public weight that they have within the country. And that's very difficult to determine, because obviously now the Houthis control large parts and some of the most important parts of Yemen. And, we'll have to see whether this can be represented. If you then say that Ansar Allah is actually something that comes just from the northern province, or that the Houthis are from the northern province and are therefore only represented there and get only a fraction of the kind of political say that they want to have, then this is not going to be something the Houthis will be pleased about. But I think this is for a later peace agreement to be determined. I think, first of all, showing good faith, goodwill in now from both parties to say, actually, we're willing to accept the other party and accept that the other party has an input, and the Houthis particularly, I think is a good sign, and that is a beginning to suggest also to the UN that there is a willingness to talk.
All right, Hussain al Bukhaiti in Sanaa. After the collapse of the Geneva talks, the crisis group accused the Houthis of last-minute gamesmanship that sent a clear message that they are not serious, which confirmed the suspicions of the coalition. Are the Houthis serious about peace in Yemen?
Of course, they are really, really serious. And we remember that they have accepted to go to Dhahran al-Janub, south of Saudi Arabia, for talks, and as well to Kuwait, even though Kuwait is a part of this coalition war. They did refuse to go to a country that has launched a war against them. And about Geneva, we know that why it collapsed, because Houthi delegates from Sanaa were not given any guarantees from the United Nations for their safety and for their safe return. And if you just let me mention that after previous Kuwait talk, Saudi Arabia refused to let the Yemeni Sanaa delegates to come back to Sanaa, and they were stuck in Muscat for about 70 days. So they really wanted to go to this talk. They accepted from the beginning, but what seems to be the problem that the Saudi-led coalition actually is using these kind of talks to start a new operation or to start a new attack. We know there was peace talk before the invasion or the attack of Aden, and before the control of Mocha by the coalition forces, and before Geneva. We have seen that a mass attack was conducted on Hodeidah, one of the last humanitarian line for millions of Yemeni. So I don't, and I think just to about what the Hadi government foreign minister have said about to accept the Houthi if they will, and he talked about a democratic process and election. I mean, you can't talk about those things at this moment. You have first, if you want, you have to look to Yemeni civilians. What's damaging Yemeni civilians is the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. You have to agree about a ceasefire first, and then you can go to talk anywhere.
Sabah al-Kozai, if Martin Griffiths, the UN envoy, manages to get these peace talks together in as little as a few weeks, he says, can the Houthis be trusted to honour any agreement that might be reached in such peace talks?
Yeah, this is the questions, in fact. The Houthi have, in fact, agreed in so many occasions to fulfill their signatures, but they fail to do so. They are not to be trusted at all. There are several, agreements and, initiatives being signed between the warring, teams or sides, but the Houthis have never, ever implemented, any one of them. And the reason behind that is very clear, because they are backed by the Iranian regime. the enemy of the Arabs, and especially the Arab in the Gulf countries. And he cannot, the Houthi, they cannot take their own decisions, their own initiatives, because they are, doing the, they are the proxies of the Iranian regime. And the other evidence is the last, Geneva talks, which supposed to be, carried out at that time, and people all over the world were hoping that anything, good will come out, from that, negotiation. But unfortunately, they abandoned. They didn't turn up. They didn't come, and we were under the Mr. Griffiths and the legitimate government representative were there for 3 days, and the Houthi didn't turn up. Why? Because they haven't got the green light from the Tehran regime.
All right, so Saba, you talked about Iran there. Are Saudi Arabia and the UAE sincere in their desire for a negotiated peace in Yemen? Can they be trusted if what they actually want is peace on their terms and to rid Yemen of any Iranian influence?
No, this is not true. I mean, the peace, the terms is of the United Nations Resolution 2216. End of story. And this is very clear. Why not the United Nations or Mr. Griffiths, work hard to implement this United Nations Resolution 2216? And the stand of the legitimate, governments and the allied forces, I mean, the coalition, the Arab coalition, is okay. The Houthi, you are not allowed to be, to control the whole Yemen. You are, a minority, or you are, part of the Yemenis people. So if you want to get involved in the political process, you're most welcome. But as a military, as a militia, armed by Iran, the sole enemy of the Arabs, no, this is not accepted. And the Arabs' allied forces, they will not accept at all that the Houthi will become like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the militias in Iraq. No way, no way. They will not accept that at all. So it's very clear. If you want if you want to make peace, if you are, your excuse is humanitarian, issues, okay, accept the 2216, sit down and agree. But the trouble is, they've been used as a playing card by the Iranian regime in the upcoming battle for life with Trump administration next sets of embargoes embargoes in the beginning of November.
Okay, Andreas, to what extent are we talking about the elephant in the room here? Where does Iran and Iranian influence play into the current conflict?
Huge. I mean, we have to make one thing clear, because what I just heard from the previous speaker is this narrative of Iran as the evil empire, and this securitization of Iran as the most concerning threat to the Arab world. This is a new conservative narrative that very well resonates with the current Trump administration in the White House, and it is something that the Americans are pushing for across the region with the help of Saudi Arabia and the UAE against the Iranians. And in that way, the Houthis have long been stated and overstated as merely a militia that works for the Iranians, and that's simply not true or too simplistic. If we look at it in reality, is that the Houthis are an indigenous Yemeni movement. They're homegrown, and they weren't built by the Iranians, but they have received funding, they've received training, and then over the last couple of years actually have become a very extensive part of the Iranian war on the Arabian Peninsula. But that is only after they have already been established for many years. So I would say in recent years, we have to be very clear that the Houthis are very much only capable to fight with ballistic missiles because they have, and fight in a very effective way in urban combat, is because they have trainers from Iran on the ground, and they have had extensive support from Iran. However, the Houthis do not need the Iranians per se. If the Houthis are being provided with an alternative, an alternative where they get guarantees of security and where they can be part of a peace agreement, where they get a seat on the table, I think that Ansar Allah or the Houthis in general could be convinced to sever ties with the Iranians, because they don't need the Iranians. They're first and foremost, advancing the interest of Zaydis in the north, a particular group in the north. And they have basically gone into that relationship with the Iranians because they thought it was beneficial. Now, if there is an alternative that shows that political life in Yemen would be more beneficial under a peace agreement, and they would have to sever Iran for that, ties with Iran for that, I think they would be very willing to do that. Also because both sides, there's something we have to highlight here, both sides, the coalition as well as the Houthis, are in a mutually hurting stalemate. That's to say, both of them understand that continuing this war as it stands today will hurt them more than a political settlement. And I think that's why both sides are interested in it. However, it has to come with certain guarantees, and that is the key problem. If there are no guarantees, I think the Houthis will continue getting the funding and reach out to the Iranians to get that funding. But to continue with the narrative of saying the Houthis are merely an Iranian proxy that has to be exterminated is not going to provide any solution to the conflict. And I think that the coalition has now understood that.
All right, Hussain, I'll come to you in just a moment. First, let me give Sabah a right to reply here. Would US pressure on Iran alter the outcome of any peace talks on Yemen, Sabah? To what extent do the Houthis need Iranian support, do you think, to maintain their hold on the country?
100%. I mean, I'm really surprised, to hear this, from my colleagues from London, saying that the Houthi they don't depend on Iran. They depend on them 100%. They are the proxies of the Iranians. They can't do anything without Iran. The Hezbollah expert, the Al-Quds brigades and Al-Haras al-Thawri, the Revolutionary Guards of Iran experts and even fighters, they are in Sauda. They are amongst the Houthis. The Houthis, firing missiles, strategic missiles, to Saudi Arabia is with the help of the experts from Iran. So the Houthis are, in fact, another brigade of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, as simple as that. They represent 5% of the Yemeni's population. So your question is, the next November is going to be the end of the Iranian regime effect in the country, believe it or not. And the Houthis, if they want to act and to be considered as Yemenis 100%, they have to act immediately and stop fighting. And surrender, not surrender, at least pull out from the major cities, agree to the table, come to the table, to the peace token table, and say, look, we need to implement the 2216.
Okay, Hussain, you want to come in? The Houthis are the proxy of Yemen. They rely on the proxy of Iran. I'm sorry, they rely on Iran 100%. What's your response to that?
I mean, let's say if what he said is true about the proxy of Iran in Yemen, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia is a proxy as well for the United States and United Kingdom. They are supplied with all the weapons from there. The war was declared from Washington, D.C., was not declared from Saudi Arabia. And to keep just blaming Iran, actually, I mean, look at this blockade. About 4 years, they control Yemen sky, they destroyed all the airport, control the sea, and how can Iran, as he mentioned, supply all these weapons? So this means that your blockade, actually, that you started to stop the flow of weapons, as you mentioned, to Yemen, has failed. This means that you are responsible for all those civilians that have died because of the Saudi-led coalition blockade on Yemen. And his previous comment, he spoke about that there was many agreement that has been signed with the Houthi, but during the previous peace talk, but they haven't kept their word. He hasn't mentioned any agreement. Even in Kuwait, they haven't signed anything. What was in Kuwait talk, it was about they have the political process and they had the security process. The Saudi-led coalition want to start with the security process, asking Houthi movement to hand their weapons, and they said then we will start about political process. No one is crazy will hand his weapons before starting forming either a coalition government between all parties in Yemen. And what the Saudi actually need in Yemen, they want a victory, they want even agreement in their terms. And we have seen what the Saudi have done or have said against the UN expert report. They refuse this report, and they even say that we are not going to deal with the UN expert anymore. So they just want a report or a peace talk or anything that is in favor of the Saudi-led coalition war in Yemen. And if the United States and the United Kingdom actually has not supported the Saudi, I don't think they could have ever started the war in Yemen. And it's really, really silly for someone to ask Houthis, which is Yemeni, to withdraw from cities while we have a kind of foreign invasion. That's why they call it Saudi-led coalition. It's not a civil war. It's a coalition made from one of the most dictatorship country in the region who want to reinstate democracy in Yemen. Who can believe that?
Andreas, I know you want to come back on that. We're rapidly running out of time here. But I want to ask you, would a peace deal between the Houthis and Yemen's government end the country's civil war? I know you said that, first of all, we've got to achieve a ceasefire, but if it got as far as a peace deal, could that bring about an end to the civil war? And to what extent is the US exacerbating the situation in Yemen right now?
Yeah, a lot of questions there. I mean, first of all, yes, I said what we need is a ceasefire, and this will be a ceasefire between the Saudi and UAE coalition, the Hadi government, and the Houthis only. And that is one war of many wars that are going on in Yemen at the moment. One big elephant in the room that we haven't spoken about is the southern movement, is the SDC, are the various proxies of the Emiratis in the south that have their own life, have their own objectives, and are pursuing their own agenda, which for the most part is very much secessionist. That in itself will create and will continue to pose a problem as we move along. And if we don't address that, then a peace deal between the Houthis and the Hadi government and the coalition might bring peace or a somewhat a settlement in the north, but will create a whole bunch of other spoilers in the same way that the Houthis have been spoilers to since 2012. When the Houthis withdrew from the 2012 from the national dialogue, they became spoilers to the conflict. The only reason they expanded and were able to receive support and also used a military action to gain control of territory was because they were not included in the peace deal afterwards. They were excluded, and that created the problem. Now, when we have a peace deal now, or a peace project, or a peace negotiations, and we leave all these other actors around in the east and in the south out of this process, you're never going to create an inclusive process for Yemen. And I think that is going to be one of the major problems.
Okay.
The United States...
Yeah, as far as the United States is concerned, I mean, with continued arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and by certifying, as it did recently, that the coalition is meeting the requirements of the National Defense Authorization Act, is it, as the crisis group says, sending the wrong message at the wrong time, namely that the coalition can continue to act with impunity?
Yes, because it's part of a war over narratives against Iran. They have framed the Yemen conflict as a war against Iran, and I think that is misleading because the Yemeni war will continue with or without the Iranians. So the problem here is that the Americans are giving support to a coalition that so far has been attacked for war crimes, and we've got all kinds of evidence for that. And a coalition that doesn't seem to pursue until now a political process. So I think the Americans have to put pressure, and the reason that Al Jubair and all other GCC countries, particularly Saudi and the UAE, are now willing to talk about a political process in Yemen is because the Trump administration has made it clear that they will have to see a change on the ground in the way they conduct themselves, because there's a lot of pressure from Congress and also obviously in Europe a lot of pressure from the public asking questions of why are we continuously supporting the Saudis and the Emiratis when they don't stand and stick by international humanitarian law. And I think this kind of pressure is now felt in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and that's why I think partially they're trying to come around. But so far, it's all talk. We haven't seen any action on the ground because the war continues. And so far, there is no sign that there will be any political process.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we must leave it. Many thanks to all of you for being with us. Andreas Krieg, Hussain al Bukhaiti and Sanaa al Kozai. And as always, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time just by going to the website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion about our topic today, go to our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.